Hello, friends, and welcome to Impact Everywhere, the podcast that looks for people having a positive impact in unexpected places. Today, we dive into the big world of impact investing with Dr. Charly Kleissner. Charly has been trying to do impact investing for almost 20 years now, ever since he had a massive payday in Silicon Valley. Over that time frame, he not only started his own foundation, which we'll refer to as KLF for a lot of this podcast. He's also the co-founder of Tonic, that's Tonic with 2 I's, and he's used that network to pioneer a brand new concept called Deep Impact, where some of their members will place 100% of their assets into impact, which means that they're always going to prioritize impact returns and not financial returns. The amount of money that they've managed to collect so far? $6 billion. Amazing. Charly and I actually met through this very podcast, which is awesome since it's the whole reason I started the podcast in the first place, to meet and have conversations with cool people. And one of the listeners recommended him as a potentially interesting guest, and we hopped on a couple of phone calls, explored which topics we could possibly tackle, and voila. This episode takes place in 2 parts. The first part really focuses on Charly's investment philosophy and why he thinks the entire system is broken and needs to be overhauled. The second is the other half of the equation, which he believes is the consciousness revolution that needs to happen in order to get us to where we need to go. There's a little bit of everything in this week's podcast, and I can't wait for you guys to experience it. I know I learned a ton, and so without further ado, this is Charly Kleissner, and here he is explaining how he came to the terminology of deep impact.
A few years ago, I ran into a terminology called Deep Ecology. And the basic difference between deep ecology and ecology is that deep ecology takes a non-anthropocentric view, a non-human-centric view of ecology, which means that humans do not stand in the center of the universe and have the authority and the permission to control the environment or to control other tribes. And that really spoke to me, because I think that if you ask the question about why is humanity in trouble right now, the imagination that we are better and outside of the nature, if you wish, creates all sorts of entitlements and all sorts of actions that otherwise you would not be able to justify, including hurting the environment, including hurting biodiversity. If you fundamentally believe that you're part of it, then you would actually not have the opportunity to act that way. And so deep impact, I define similarly like deep ecology as a way of doing systemic change with your investments based on a consciousness and awareness that does not make you special. Sometimes I talk about it, it's the soul level investment. Soul is more than your body. It's not religious, it's a spiritual concept. And if you just invest with your brain, then you will not be able to go deep, because your brain is not enabled to go deep. The soul is able to go deep. And so the deep impact movement, if you wish, is taking a non-human centric view of investing in the future that is focused on not just treating the symptoms of the issues that we run into on the systemic level, but the root causes.
That sounds super interesting, I think, in concept. And it's almost what we would hope that philanthropy or nonprofits would be. But when you come down to actually executing or doing it, it's quite a different story. How do you actually de-risk deep impact? Because the whole idea behind deep impact is removing the person or removing the ego from the equation, yet the whole concept of investing is about putting money so that you can grow your wealth and provide for your family and so forth.
You cannot de-risk deep impact. It's impossible. And so the deep impact movement has to grapple with very fundamental and vulnerable questions about your own role in investing. And so the deep impact investors actually explore the questions of how much is enough for themselves. What do they expect? Are they detached enough from their wealth that if they lose it and have a deep impact, that's okay or not? So those are really questions that not everybody, or maybe only the vast minority, will be able to explore. It explores the fact that we all benefit from the existing system, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously or unconsciously. Let's make it more concrete as an example. My wife Lisa and I, we always scan the horizon, so to speak, to figure out if we can invest in something that really has the chance of making a difference, a fundamental difference of how the financial system works. And we discovered the social impact bonds, about 10 years ago. It was the first social impact bond in the UK. And the social impact bonds, the way that they work is that the investor gets more financial return if the impact that they have is deeper, and less of a financial return if the impact is not deep enough. And so it's the first instrument that I'm aware of, financial instrument, that explicitly ties the amount of financial return to the impact that we have. The first social impact bond out of the UK dealt with the topic of recidivism. So it dealt with the fact that in this particular county of the UK, 40% of male offenders who were incarcerated and left the prison system were back in the prison system about a year later, 40%. And so society can put a value, a monetary value on that, and only about the primary impact of how much it costs to incarcerate a person, not even talking about the secondary and tertiary impact of family destruction and long-term incapacities and all that, just the primary impact. And so if through our investments we were to be able to have that, let's say, diminish the recidivism rate from 40% to 20%, society saves a bunch of money. And if we're able to prove that our intervention does that with a controlled study group, then the government would pay the impact investors a certain return. And so in this instance, after about 5 years, I think we proved that through our intervention, we were able to lower the recidivism rate in that particular county by 10-11%. And the contract said if we are able to do that, we would get a financial return of 3%. If we had reduced it even further, we could have gotten a financial return of up to 13%. And if it didn't make a difference, we would have lost all the money. So a financial instrument that actually explicitly ties the financial return to impact. If you could put an equity layer on top of that, then you would have a public equity for the first time that would actually go up and down with the impact, right? The holy grail, which right now it doesn't. But we have now 150 social impact bonds, and we talk maybe about the follow-on model, which is called tokenization of impact, which would actually maybe get it to the level where we would feel comfortable that now our intervention of social impact bonds is actually leading to a financial way of dealing with impact that's deeper and more fundamental than anything that's on the market today.
I love this idea of a social impact bond where returns are tied to impact. It sounds so obvious when you say it, and it's, why hasn't this spread more popularly? Can you explain to me the difference between deep impact and just philanthropy or altruism? Because in many ways, it sounds like that's what it is. You're just trying to give your money away for the betterment of humanity, and there's no strings attached. But I think your approach is a little bit more complex than that.
It's more complex than that. When we looked into how philanthropy was done, we noticed that the classical philanthropy is part of the problem, because classical philanthropy does handouts. They create dependencies. They distort the markets. They create corrupt systems. We were active in Sri Lanka after the big tsunami. It was just insanity upon insanity. The big NGOs drove around in their Land Cruisers with $200,000 salaries, and the poor fishing villages got nothing out of that, nothing. And so philanthropy just got stuck all the way in the value chain. And similarly, when we looked into pure investments, the pure maximization of profits for the investors, rolling off all the externalities, the negative ones on the social side and the environmental side to the commons, it was just wrong. And so we didn't believe that the pure investment model or the pure philanthropy model would be appropriate for us, because it was too simplistic and actually created more problems than solutions. So I worked with Steve Jobs for a number of years back in the 90s, and I'm missing him these days, because I think at this stage in his life, if he were still around, he would actually question how philanthropy is done. He always questioned the status quo. And Bill Gates, of course, made his fortune by copying successful technology and brilliantly scaling it up. And it takes a lot of effort and a lot of acumen to do that. But what he's doing now is scaling the old philanthropy model, which doesn't work to solve the big issues of our time, like inequality, social justice, climate change, and scales it up. And so if you scale something up that doesn't work, you create actually more problems. So my objective is to show Bill Gates through our deep impact investing methodology, that he should copy that and scale it up, and then we would be fine. So he has proven that he is able to do that, and I hope that he will be able to do that in the not too distant future.
Okay, this is super interesting though, because I'm not actually that familiar with the Bill Gates philanthropy model and the Charly Kleissner impact model. So can we do a quick comparison here, just so that everyone who's listening can hear why your idea is so much better than Bill Gates's?
Of course. The normal foundations in the US, they are required by law to give out 5% of their endowment per year in either grants or subsidized investments. And the 95% is usually static and is invested in whatever you believe is the right investments. Bill Gates and the majority of all the foundations, particularly the big ones, they are investing the 95% of their corpus in anything that maximizes their returns, which is absurd, right? Because you get the tax exempt status from society in order to contribute to the mission of your foundation. If the mission of your foundation is to make a difference in climate change, and on the investment side, you invest in ExxonMobil, hello, it doesn't take a PhD to figure out that actually your investments in ExxonMobil does more harm than you could ever do on the grant side. And so what we have pioneered, now we're not the only ones doing that, is what we call 100% investments of foundations. And so that the 100% of the corpus of the foundation is actually aligned with impact investments on the mission of what you got the tax exempt status for from the society, as opposed to continuing to pollute and to extract and not to clean up and to continue maximizing profits at the expense of everything else in 95%, and then graciously giving out a small amount of capital, 5% per year, in order to fix what you did with your investments in the first place. And so the difference is that we have a holistic approach that takes all the assets that we have in a foundation, and we take plenty capital approaches where we combine grants, subsidized capital, and commercial capital, if you wish, in order to have a deeper impact in something that grants alone could not do, or that capital alone could not do. And that integrated way, I think, is the way forward to deal with the biggest systemic issues that also the SDGs are trying to address moving forward. And if you don't do that, you contribute to them knowingly or unknowingly.
In so many ways, people have the same problem, right? Many people don't actually know what their money is doing. So if I work really hard to do campaigns for social activism, and I'm putting my money in a bank, what is the bank doing with the money? Or where is the 401k sitting? Like, where is all that capital being deployed, and how is it being invested is actually a big question mark.
Exactly.
Right?
And you don't have to be rich to answer and ask that question. And so banks is a great example. I'm glad that you brought it up. When you look at the banking system in the US, and I'll make the point about global in a second, and you do your homework and explore what Bank of America and Wells Fargo are doing if you bank with them, then you will find out that they finance the coal industry, that they finance the tar sand industry, that they finance the weapons industry. And people like us, we would not want to have our money knowingly contribute to these things. And so if you're like us and you have values that you want to have reflected in whom you bank with, you should act on that. And the great news in the US is that there is alternatives for these big banks that are very transparent with respect to what they do with your money. We invested, for instance, in Southern Bancorp, a really interesting bank in the south of the US in very difficult situations. And they are getting our money and then deploying it for local entrepreneurs that are African American that normally don't get financing, and then they get our money. Basically, it gets recycled in order to do it transparently, something that we believe in, as opposed to financing the next pipeline that we don't believe in. Or CDFIs, that's community development financing institutions. In the US, there's so much poverty, that 20, 30, 40% of the people in some areas are outside the banking system. And so if you bank with a CDFI, then you know that the poorest of the poor who don't have access to the banking system will actually get access to a banking account and all that. And so it's crucial that we don't allow our money to go to banks that actually contribute to these issues if there's alternatives.
And the best part about it all is there's no risk. You're still getting your same percentage rate of return. You're really just storing your money in somewhere that's going to put it to better use.
It's CDFI insured, which means if the bank goes belly up, you still have the insurance. Right? And you get the same, we actually got maybe 12 basis points more over the last 15 years in our return with banks that we bank in than the normal benchmarks, right? Now, globally speaking, there is a global alliance of value-based banks. I think they have about 40 banks right now in part of that, and they are committed to transparently managing the money of their clients. So in Netherlands, it's Triodos Bank. In Germany, it's GLS Bank. In France, it's Crédit Coopératif. Here in the Bay Area, and there's a couple of others in North America that sign up for the modern way of banking that does not contribute to the weaponization of humanity or the extractive nature of businesses that most banks finance that are not part of that movement.
I love this. Do you think you could provide us with a link to all these different options that are out there? I think it would be a really great resource.
Of course, yeah, we can do that. I'll forward that to you. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you. I remember recently talking to my financial investor about this exact problem and saying, hey, I want to make sure that my money goes into more sustainable places. And then he's just like, yeah, don't worry about it. Our thing is like ESG compliant. We're not investing in weapons or something like that. And so ESG stands for like environmental, social governance. And so for the most part, it's supposed to have some kind of public good embedded in the system, but yet it doesn't quite seem to do that when you dig a little bit deeper. Can you tell me like what the problem with ESGs are and how we might go around like to fix it?
Yeah, sure. So you see, one of the first problems might be that you said your advisor is a he. And I think most advisors are he's or male, and they shouldn't, because at least half of them should be female, as last time I checked. And so and we need to really fix that too. And if you're not happy with your advisor, then maybe you give a female advisor an opportunity to work with you, because maybe she's even more aligned, maybe not. It depends. But so ESG has become a really big movement in the last 5 years. And a lot of the ESG funds and big financial corporations, they pretend as if ESG is impact. It's not. So ESG is a good way of managing your company. And a good way of managing your company, of course, usually results in better financial returns, which they now are catching up to. So if you have a diversified board, well, that creates better financial returns on the G side, the governance side, right? If you actually use your resources like water and electricity better and less, then that will be reflected on your profitability. So it's just good management practice. There's nothing to do good about that. Usually it's just a management practice that makes a ton of sense. And if you want to know which weapons company you should invest in, if that's your gig, then choose the one that has the best ESG score, and you will find one. I just cannot put myself into investing in any weapons company, even if it has the best diversified board. They're still producing weapons. British Petroleum used to have a very good ESG score, but I could care less. They're still messing up the planet. And yes, if you want to invest in oil and gas, maybe you should invest in the best ESG, because it's the best managed oil and gas company on the planet according to these metrics. And so even if all the $100 trillion of institutional capital would move into ESG, I would submit that it will have zero positive effect on solving the big issues of our times: inequality, social justice, and accelerating climate change mitigation and solutions. It will, as a matter of fact, continue to accelerate it. Because if you don't question the power structures between the investor and the investee and leave out everybody else, then that by default creates more inequality. And it by default creates more opportunities for the big companies to make more money. So it's brilliant. They found a way to actually continue to maximize their profits at the expense of cleaning up the bigger issues of social justice and inequality and climate change, while pretending to do good. And so it's a brilliant scheme, and most people actually believe it, but it will not make any contribution to the systemic issues of our times.
So basically what you're saying is that ESGs are basically making problems sustainable instead of creating sustainable solutions. Yeah. So it's the opposite. And I guess it makes sense, right? Because you're truly just supporting an existing system, whereas what you're describing is more systemic change. I think it's the same problem that we hear of in corporate social responsibility. That's the bare minimum. Like every company should be responsible. what we're really looking for are people who are leading the way into the next chapter.
One issue might be shareholders versus stakeholders, which is a big discussion going on. And ESG has nothing to say about involving all the stakeholders. It continues to maximize profits for the shareholders, which are usually rich people who are becoming richer, right? As opposed to involving all the stakeholders, including beneficiaries and in between. And that's where I think the follow-on model where private equity is just not the right model and venture capital is not the right model for deep impact, because that's the problem with that, right? It just funnels more money to the rich and it has nothing to say about everybody else.
Definitely. So you've tried to tackle these issues in many different ways. I think what was super impressive when I was reading through your portfolio is all the different things that you've started over the last 20 different years. Could you walk me through, like, maybe the first one, when you guys managed to cash out, quote unquote, in the 2000s, the first thing that you did was create a foundation. Why did you start with the KL Felicitas Foundation?
So we saw, like I insinuated before, that classical philanthropy and normal investment strategies are not serving us in our desire to change the system to the better. And so we asked the question, well, what would help us to do that? And when you study systems like I did in my professional life, and you're a systems thinker, then you also know that systems change when they come under sufficient pressure, and they don't change if they don't come under pressure. And so when you fast forward and look around in what's going on, COVID is the symptom of the pressures that our system, that our behavior is putting on the system. It's not the cause. And climate change, it's not the cause, but a symptom of our behavior and our financial models. And so we looked at KLF, the KL Felicitas Foundation, from the very beginning as the instrument that we have at our disposal to really figure out how to invest in the new system as opposed to the old system. Now, when systems change, then you need to speak dual language. You have to speak the language of the old dying system while you invent the terminology of the new system. The new system I would call the deep impact economy, and the old system is philanthropy as usual and investment as usual. And so while our objective is to change the system, we have to make the arguments in the language of the old dying system. And therefore, we said, let's prove with a 10-year track record in the terminology of the monetary system as it stands today, including the modern portfolio theory, which obviously is not modern and really wrong. But in order to be heard, you need to make your argument in that. And so we said, let's prove that you can go as deep into impact with KL Felicitas Foundation as we can, while maintaining the constraint of having what they call market rate returns, which is really the wrong paradigm. And we're moving beyond that now, but that was very important in order to be heard, right? And you can position yourself as an extremist and a revolutionary, or you can say that, well, I want to make my arguments so I'm heard by the current establishment as well, while I design the new system. And so we did KLF in order to invest in these new paradigms that have a chance of changing the system, like social impact bonds. We also invested in the first social stock exchange. So democratization of impact investing is a big topic. And without having everybody participate in that, we will not be able to change the system. And so if we could create a social stock exchange where people will be able to invest small amounts in equities that are actually really making a change as opposed to not, then everybody could participate in that particular investment. Was not successful yet, and we lost all of our investment money because it was a little bit too early. We needed to partner with existing stock exchanges. And existing stock exchanges, it's a stretch to include ESG that we just talked about in their evaluation. And that, of course, is not sufficient for us. But we don't consider our investment in that a failure, because if in the future beautiful new social stock exchanges are happening, and I think there are a few happening in Japan and India right now as we speak, and they were inspired by the financial failure of what we tried to do, then we still consider our investment a success, because we were able to spawn, hopefully, a whole industry, ultimately with our little capital, that then will enable future generations of investors to do what we tried to do earlier. And so we also invest in many first-time managers that do things differently. First-time managers are shunned by the industry because the industry does not support them. And so a little capital from our little foundation goes a long way. And we just invested in something like an Aquaspark, a European fund that's an evergreen fund. And just getting the first 10 billion of investments, we made our little contribution to that. And now they're getting more successful, and they have 150 million euros under management after 7 years. So we consider our seed investment in that, and they do things differently. Green investment fund doesn't have the closures. It doesn't have the normal fund structures. So you see how Lisa and I are trying to stir the pot, so to speak, to initiate new ways of investments. And now we're, of course, investing in the tokenization of impact, which is the next wave of innovation that needs to happen in order to integrate impact into the new economy in a fundamental way, not just as an add-on as CSR, which is a side effect of the incorporation models, where officers of a publicly held company, and I was one of them in my professional life, don't get a choice. If you're not incorporated as a B Corp, then you need to maximize the shareholder value. Otherwise, you get sued. And that is just the wrong incorporation model. So we have to change that. And so we invest in that as well.
Right. It's super interesting to hear you talk. I mean, I almost feel like this sort of hyper capitalism is a brand new concept. It's not something that existed in the Industrial Revolution, really. And so is it the model of venture capital that really broke things? And if so, why is that?
So if you look at why venture capital was invented in the 60s and then 70s and then went to scale in the 80s, it was in support of the chip economy. So the chip was invented, transistors, and Moore's law enables the chip economy to double their capacity every 1.5 years. And what that enables you to have financial exits within 7 years that are quite lucrative for this new asset class, which was called venture capital. So it's optimizing a one-time financial exit for the limited partners and general partners with no discernible concern about any positive impact. It's not being discussed, right? It might happen or it might not happen. It's a side effect. And so if you think about what the impact economy is all about, it's just the opposite. We care about long-term sustainable impact with an appropriate financial return. And that appropriate financial return is not a huge return. It's maybe a little bit more than inflation, but it's somewhere in that space, right? And so to believe that the venture capital model would be the appropriate model for the impact economy is a fallacy. And therefore, we need to invent a new way of investing in the impact economy that goes beyond the venture capital and the private equity. The impact investors have done different types of investments where, for instance, we get paid our return by the cash flow of a company, not equity and not debt. So if a company makes a profit and then returns some of the profit to its investors, that money is not taken away from the equity, and you don't need the collateral for the entrepreneur in order to get banked. And so a lot of entrepreneurs don't have access to equity capital because they don't create a big enough upside for investors, and they might not have enough collateral to get access to debt. And so that's where impact investors can come in and make a difference with the different capital and impact expectations.
So the other things that you've done besides KLF was start both ImpactAssets and Tonic. These are two different approaches to having an impact within the financial markets. Could you break down what these two were and how they're different from everything that existed in the market prior?
Yeah, certainly. When Lisa and I got more engaged, we talked about the supply side of capital, the demand side of capital, and the intermediaries in trying to figure out where to deploy our capital. It was not easy, and it still is not easy to go deep into impact. And when we started, we had to do very lightweight impact because there was not much available. But there was pressure building on the advisors and to people like us to say, we need more, we want more. And if there's capital demanding that, then the industry reacts, right? And so now we see a lot more happening, and you can build a 100% portfolio much easier and much faster than we did it. But we also saw the need for a support network and a cooperation and co-creation network for investors, because at that point in time, the advisors just did not know how to serve us because it was a new industry. And we educated our advisors to come with us on this journey. And now there are, quite a few available in the US and globally that help new impact investors come along. And so we saw the need for co-starting a network, for a global network for impact investors and for private impact investors like ourselves. And at that point in time, a year before we started Tonic, the GIN was created for institutional investors, and GIIN, Global Impact Investing Network. And I called up, the CEO of GIN and said, look, we're not institutional capital, but we want to do something similar to what you do for institutions for us. And we want to call it Tonic. Are you okay with that? And he said, of course. And that's when 11 years ago, we started the Tonic Global Network of Impact Investors. And now it's about half the community of Tonic members are 100% impact investors who have dedicated at least one of their portfolios 100% to impact. And half of that crowd is part of the deep impact movement that we talked about before, where we go very much deeper in our own, into not just our impactful investments, but an impactful life. What does it mean to lead an impactful life if you have wealth to deploy as investments? And it's an emergence happening, which is very grateful to see. And there is hundreds of people around the globe who are doing that now.
What is the criteria to be a Tonic investor?
Yeah.
Is it just a wealth criteria? Is it a job criteria? Do you have to be part of a certain institution or foundation? How does it work?
Yeah, at this point in time, you have to be what's called an accredited investor, which is for wealthier people. You don't have to be super wealthy. The sweet spot for Tonic members is, I would say, 3 million of investable capital up to $500 million. And so Tonic is not the right network for retail investors or people who want to do crowdfunding and have maybe a few tens of thousands of dollars to invest in. Somebody needs to create a network for that type of person. And it's right, now with crowdfunding taking off, I think it's time for a network to emerge on that level. And so it would be great to see that. And then so Tonic is a big tent. If you just want to make one investment that's impactful, that's great. If you want to go 100%, that's great. We don't expect that you to do that. And if you then want to explore the spiritual nature of leading an impactful life in the context of your wealth, then you can join the Deep Impact movement as part of the Tonic crowd. And again, the Tonic is not the only one doing that. There's an emergence of consciousness and awareness happening if you know where to look.
Maybe that's going to be your next thing, because you mentioned a little bit earlier the importance of democratizing access to impact.
Yes.
And so finding a way to make that as inclusive as possible to bring everyone on board, like the Robin Hood of conscious investing, would be really interesting. If ever you stumble across it, I'd love to hear more about it.
Yeah, it is now. And ImpactAssets, I don't know if you want to talk about that or not.
Yeah, please. Yeah, let's all give me a rundown of ImpactAssets too, of course.
So we talked about, philanthropists, and philanthropists in the US have two legal entities that they can use in order to do their philanthropy. One is a foundation, and the other one is donor advised funds. And donor advised funds are similar to foundations, except that you don't have the 5% payout requirement every year. And it's a little bit more lighter weight with respect to reporting and all that, because it's a donor advised fund that philanthropists donate their money to. They cannot get it back out. So it's really locked in. Then they decide over time where they deploy their philanthropic capital. And ImpactAssets has provided a very flexible platform for philanthropists who are donor advised fund folks to invest their capital before they give it out in grants in impact deals, as opposed to just having it in cash or having it lay around or doing some investments that are really bad with respect to what they want to do. And ImpactAssets now has just crossed the $1 billion of assets under management. I think so I'm the chairman of the board, I should say, in all transparency. And also we're an investor in ImpactAssets. And I think it's one of the deepest platforms for philanthropists to deploy their fully blended capital all the way from investments to giving it out to not-for-profits that they believe in. And donor advised funds, you can do as little as $5,000. And then you can get access to all these impact investments, for instance. So it is actually a form of democratization of philanthropy and impact.
And that one, anyone can participate in?
Yeah, I think $5,000 or $10,000, you can say, I create a donor advised fund that will eventually go to donations. But while I figure out how to go into donations, I can direct the money to an impact investment.
And is this money that you get a return on, or is this money that's just...
Yes, but you cannot use it for your own. And so the return goes back into your account. You cannot take the return out for personal usage, right? It's like a foundation in that sense. The foundation's investments create a return And then if it's a big return, the foundation can use it to do whatever it does. And I advocated for 100% to align your investments with your granting philosophy and strategy.
Got it. That's super fun. Cool. I want to take a break from all this technical stuff and talk a little bit about your personal journey, just because I think there's something really interesting there. I was listening to one of your prior interviews and you said this line, which was that where you place your capital reflects who you are as a person. And I want to actually rewind all the way back in time before you had this big payday when you were working as a VP at a big, tech company. Where was your capital being deployed at that point in time? And what would have made you be more conscious without needing that payday?
Yeah. So when I reflect on the way up to that, what they call liquidity event in jargon, right? You get liquidity of something that you worked for before. It's not liquid. And then if you go public or bought out, then you have liquidity. Both Lisa and I come from a middle class families and environments. And so we were not really prepared to either know what it means to become wealthy or what to do with that initially. And also with liquidity events, it goes fairly quickly because then within 3 years we diversified. And so you go from a fairly normal middle class income life to having a lot of resources. When I even look back into my childhood, one thing that I remember and that I still practice is the art of self-observation. And it's not an outer body experience fully. It's just a way of having a consciousness about what you do and almost like observing it as an outsider. Because that gives you a distance a little bit of your ego, of your brain, of your own self-importance. And it gives you an opportunity to chuckle about what you do. So I remember as a quote unquote big executive in Silicon Valley, I traveled over to all these, I had distributed teams and this and that and press conferences and this and that. And sometimes I just said, look at this weird life that Charly, almost like in third person, is leading. And I never really became my role. And having a liquidity event, I think, gave me and us the opportunity to become who I really am. But like we all sometimes have to play roles in life, sometimes voluntarily, sometimes involuntarily. But I had that inkling all the way along. And then I accelerated that to a mindfulness journey. That's one. And then when I started my mindfulness practice and started meditating, then you start realizing that you're not your thoughts. By meditating, you experience the thoughts coming and going, and it's just part of the human experience. Then you get more to the essence of who you really are, and that's your soul. When you're sitting on a rocket ship in Silicon Valley as the CTO, you don't have a lot of time to meditate. But I did a little bit back then, but not the way that I was able to do afterwards. And without taking the time, you cannot reap the benefits.
What I'm hearing is that this sort of shift into a fully impactful life has been coming along. We were waiting for the right event to trigger it. And to your point about the conscious mind.
But it's also important to acknowledge, and I do want to acknowledge that I was a big believer in Silicon Valley and in hard work and you will be rewarded and all that. I did believe in that. And it took me a long time to unlearn that I would be in charge of the outcome, because as a trained executive, you're trained and evaluated on imagining the business outcome that you want to manage towards. And really how it works is we are not in control of that. And it took me quite a while and most people, I was 45 when I stepped off the treadmill of Silicon Valley, and most particularly men who were at the prime of their career where everybody says how great they are, and you're offered so many other jobs, they decide to go back on the treadmill. And I had the foresight and the desire to step off because it didn't serve the rest of my life, which I thought would be more impactful than the first 45 years. And I hope they will be. We'll see.
I guess the reason for the question was because I feel like so many people want to do good, but so many people don't know how to get there, and they're not ready to fully throw themselves selflessly at a problem until they know that they can take care of themselves, their family, their friends, so on and so forth. And so I'm wondering, is there a quicker route to people becoming more conscious and that have the desire to become more impactful rather than having to climb the hierarchy, participate in all this just the rich getting richer, participate in that whole program, running on the treadmill of current human civilization in the capitalist model, and then rising to the top and then stepping off, because that is like very inefficient and effective.
Well, I think that is a very important question for all of us to answer individually and together as well. So I'm convinced that the impact of your life is a direct expression of who you are and not who you think you are. It's not an expression of your brain. It's an expression of who you are as a soul, as a human being. And so if you are a very angry person, then it will be very hard to escape that negative energy in the consequences of how you lead your life. Not necessarily because you're a bad person if you're angry, right? But if you don't really work on that, then you will have to suffer the consequences quite predictably. And if you're a peaceful person, then the same is true, that the energy that you send out and the intentionality that you send out is fundamentally different and will organize itself according to the natural law of energy organization, if you wish, to support you in that. And so if you believe in that, then you should practice that. If you practice it, then you will reap the benefits. So what you need to practice is you need to practice some type of mindfulness activity. And humanity has done mindfulness activities since 10,000 years, with the shamans starting, and shamanic discoveries have gone on in parallel. Not one over shaman did everything and dictated everything to everybody else. No, Siberian shamans were as enlightened as the North American ones, as the Incas and what have you. And so is the form of yoga. Yoga is 7,000 years old. And I'm not talking about the asanas. I'm talking about Patanjali's way of leading a life of yoga that we can choose to do or not. So is nature. If you go out into nature and you commune with nature, maybe even with a shamanic eye, you will see things differently, predictably. You can do that. Everybody can do that. You reflect. You write things down. I just mentioned 6 different mindfulness practices. Whichever one works for you, you can do that. You don't have to sit as a monk for hours a day. I wouldn't be able to do that myself and then become enlightened. I think the way towards more understanding and consciousness and awareness can be the way of action, if the action is not ego-based and decoupled from the outcomes. And so depending on who you are and what you like to do, maybe you like to sit still, maybe you like to write, maybe you like to go out in nature, maybe you like to reflect. That will be the path. But if you don't do it, you will not reap the benefits. It's practicing your arm muscle. Well, if you practice it, it will get bigger. And if you practice your mindfulness, you will predictably become more mindful, which will then have an impact on your life.
Yeah, for sure. And even I think even science is starting to come to its consciousness of these different layers that are happening within us. If we think of a habit, that's like an unconscious routine that has been established. If we think about sleeping, why do we have dreams? Because our conscious mind is asleep. So there is something there that is guiding our memories. When we look at the clouds and we see a shape in the clouds, that's our unconscious mind that is interpreting something. Nature is not painting a unicorn in the sky. Nature is just clouds. But it's the reflection of our reality. And that's why multiple people can look at the same object and have a different perception of it. And so the world we live in is like intuitively our own. And so I think it all boils down to how you interpret the world. And there's all these different things, even in the science world, like of reprogramming your mind, of seeing the same situations differently. That's what the foundation of all those Tony Robbins workshops are, of like being positive and screaming at yourself and all these incantations and so forth. So I think it all kind of ties into each other.
Yeah, I've been intrigued by the interaction of the subconsciousness and the consciousness, because the evolutionary status of our brain structure is limiting on one level, and you cannot escape it until you're brain dead, and then you will be able to escape it. And while we do that, our subconscious actually directs the majority of our body of what to do. And if you think about it, you cannot really direct the 10 trillion cells of what they should imagine. And so I do a meditation form that's called Vipassana, which is a 10-day silent meditation, where on day 6 and 7, again, predictably, so it's not magic. If you sit still that long and you go inside that long, then you will start experiencing the interrelationship between subconsciousness and consciousness. And when you experience part of your body or your whole body this energy flow, that's a good feeling. But if you start thinking about it, it goes away, right? And so you see how the subconsciousness and consciousness actually interact in a very interesting way. And so my point is that anybody who wants to experience that can, if you do the practice. And then, with lymphoma, I did a lot of that, and to help tell my cells to recover as opposed to die.
Yeah, actually, that's what I wanted to come in on. I wanted to talk about how, like, you've started focusing on impact and developing this since the 2000s. You've discovered mindfulness. You've dived really deeply into your own spirituality to perceive your role in society and how we all have a place, and that the intentions that we set create the reality that we live in. And then lymphoma hit a couple years ago, putting you in like a battle for your life. How has that affected either your business or your spiritual practice on the world?
Yeah, so it was something that I didn't foresee, because I lead a fairly healthy life and pride myself in doing all this and that, which might be a little ego-based itself. And so it's not productive to think too much about why it happened to yourself, because there's no single silver bullet. And so I'm happy with just letting that stand. However, how to deal with that is a choice. And I have to say that the first 2 weeks, so I had lymphoma, and that kind of lymphoma, where the chances of survival were 80% against me in the first 1 or 2 years. And so that puts quite a bit of focus on, well, first confusion and then focus. Let me talk about the confusion first, because maybe the first, I think, 10 days or 2 weeks of going through my first chemo treatment, I was confused about, should I do something different since it's highly likely that I will die soon or not? And I was anxious to figure that out, because I feared if I have such a limited amount of time to live, maybe I need to reprioritize. And it created some uncomfortableness in everything that I did. But then fairly quickly, I reflected on what I'm doing, also during my chemo treatments, what I can do and cannot do. And I discovered, not surprisingly looking back now, that all the topics that I was involved in were topics that are important to humanity and myself as well, but not just to myself. And I realized that all these topics, all the things that I care about, will go on without me as well. And so that enabled me to detach a little bit from that highly likely outcome that I will die, and get to peace with it. And I discovered that I didn't have a bucket list. I didn't have anything else to do. I did what I was supposed to do, which gave me a lot of freedom to feel peaceful again, because I was feeling, like I said, anxious, maybe not fearful, but certainly anxious and confused. And then I was able to take advantage almost of the opportunity of practicing dying gives you. Because practicing dying is a huge opportunity to get to grips with the finality of your own life, what it's all about, and also focus. And it got me off the planning. I'm such a big planner. And for the first time in my life, I think I said, well, I can't plan anymore, because if I'm dead, what use is it for? And therefore it was a forceful opportunity for me to get away from planning and really be in the moment, and be thankful for the other thing is thankfulness for what I was able to experience up until that point. So I pivoted, instead of being angry, which I never was, that this happened to me, to being thankful for the incredible opportunity that I had in my life. And I was thankful, if I were to live longer, that I want to make the most out of that too. Instead of being fearful of death, I became more hopeful of what I can do later in a practice. I'm so glad that I had a mindfulness practice, because it really helped me, zero in on that seeming dilemma, which is really not a dilemma, because we all have it. We just are not that focused on dying, because it's not in our consciousness until it appears. I'm in remission right now, and if I stay in remission for another 1.5 years, I would be considered cured and not be sick anymore. So right now I switched from 80-20 against me to 80-20 for me, which is great.
That's such a heartwarming story. It reminds me of one of the guests that we had. I think his name is Jack Sim. And he was saying, he's like about 65 years old or something now. And he was saying that when you die, you want to have a lot of unfinished business because that means that you've led a fulfilling life.
Yeah.
Because if you ended with an empty plate and you were just like, then that means you didn't give 100%. And the fact that you were able to like face that down and then look at all the stuff that you had built and be like, I've really lived fully and I've done the things that I really care about, how amazing of an opportunity this was. That's a really great validating sign. So I love that you found the beauty in that. So very cool, man. I want to go back to the impact measurement piece before ending on like maybe a couple actions that people can take. We mentioned a couple of times this idea of tokenization of impact. I was wondering, do you think you can tell me how impact is currently measured in the impact investing world or just impact in general? Mm-hmm. Why it's insufficient and what you have in mind as this next big generation of what's going to transform everything?
Yeah, impact investing is defined, and pretty much everybody agrees on the definition that it's about the social and environmental impact. You want to make some money too, and you have to measure the impact. And so the measurement of the impact is actually not that simple. And in what the impact community has figured out a little bit, I try not to use too much jargon here, is to measure impact with what they call outputs. And outputs are number of lives saved, number of tons of carbon offset, number of jobs created. So output is a metric that you can fairly easily measure. But the real issue with systemic impact is that's not enough. You should try to figure out what does that have to do with the health of the population, for instance. And so that's called outcomes sometimes. And that's a much more harder problem to prove, particularly prove with the current scientific terminology. Einstein, 110 years ago, has proven scientifically, not spiritually, that the observer always influences the observed. And so it's all intertwined. And you cannot say that just my intervention really is causally related to this impact effect. And so it's complicated on that level. And yet it requires, I think, another wave of innovation in order to really become more useful. And that innovation, I think, will be driven by the digitalization of impact. So if we can actually express impact in digital form, then we can layer on top of the digital representation of impact all the financial engineering that we have done on the non-digital side. So for instance, I'm working with a company called Proof of Impact. And Proof of Impact is putting impact events and puts them on a blockchain. And by putting them on a blockchain, they're immutable. They cannot be faked. They cannot be altered. And anybody looking at these events later will say that they actually did happen. And he can make this attribution of whoever finances these impact events. For instance, in this context, we're working with the Ethiopian government in lowering the mortality rate of expecting moms and their expecting babies. And we know that if they go to clinics or doctors who know how to do these exams, and they do it regularly during their pregnancy, that will predictably lower the mortality rate. So whenever a mom comes into the hospital that's part of this program, we put that event on a blockchain and say, this mom did have her checkup, and then we have a development financing bank finance tens of thousands of these events, thereby contributing to the lowering of the mortality rate in a predictable way. So you see how blockchain, impact events, financing can work together on that one. And that's just the beginning. So in 3 years, when you have a data set, then be able to correlate that data set with demographic data and healthcare data that the Ethiopian government collects for their population, use AI as a learning algorithm to see how that contributes to the outcomes of having a healthier population, including the moms. So you see how I just combined blockchain, AI, open data sets, and financing. And then you could see that later you could overlay that structure with an equity type of structure that then, like I made the argument with the social impact bonds, would fluctuate up and down in the valuation with the impact that they have. I also believe that a second example, just one more, okay, is the business model of Google and Facebook to monitor our behavior without our real consent. Legally, we consent, but we don't really consent for them using our data and selling them to Analytica and monetizing it by sending us advertisements that we really don't want. It's the wrong model. And that model is passé now. So we're at the other side of what's going to be next. And I think the monetization of your digital footprint, if you wish, including your impact, is the follow-on model to that. So right now, I have an Apple Watch, and I don't know what they do with my data, but I would have no problem selling my health-related data to a lymphoma research, not selling, I would actually give it for free to a lymphoma research institution with my name attached to it so that they can do their research, which I support, and other people who get lymphoma would not have to suffer what I have to suffer through. But if an insurance company wants my data, well, I would not sell it to them because I don't believe in that model, but maybe anonymized, maybe longitudinally, maybe whatever. So you see that we want to be the drivers of the impact data and the financial data that our lifestyle generates. And so if you think that there's 3 billion Android phones out there and that everybody has a digital footprint right now, almost half the population already, and they are not able to monetize that. So the idea is that through blockchain and through artificial intelligence again, that we would create the follow-on models of Google and Facebook that don't monetize that without your real consent, where you really benefit and you're in control of saying, I share this and I don't share that, and I share it in a way that's exclusive or not, I share it longitudinally or not, and I share it with maximizing compensation or maximizing impact. And those are interesting models I find that many people are working on that are the follow-on models of the closed systems that we have right now that will be open data sets, leveraging ethical AI to benefit the people that are marginalized right now and move forward in tokenizing impact so that everybody can participating in contributing to, let's say, financing clean air, financing the preservation of real assets like rainforests, right? If you tokenize that, then suddenly you have a whole different way of participating from all different stakeholders. Remember, I made the point that it's right now just about the shareholders, and tokenization enables you to enable all the stakeholders to participate in that economy as well in a positive way, and maybe also a negative way if they contribute negatively to it. So those are a few ideas, that I think I find fascinating, where I can contribute my being an engineer and understanding AI and blockchain with my consciousness and with impact, which is what I'm working on right now.
It all sounds so phenomenally complicated. It makes you wonder, what is the series of pressure points that are actually going to lead to the tipping point that is actually going to start catalyzing this next wave and this next paradigm shift, which all sounds, it's okay, great. It's eventually going to happen, but is it going to happen fast enough?
Nobody knows that. We don't know if it's going to happen fast enough. Nobody knows.
We never know, but I guess, but so the takeaway though that I'm gathering is that ultimately everything has to be digitized, because if you don't create a digital layer of everything that's going on to the best of your ability, then you're never going to be able to measure it. And if you're not going to be able to measure it, then you're never going to be able to correlate it tightly enough to profit margins. And so the financial institutions will only move at the same pace that impact can be measured. And what I'm reading between the lines is that's the piece of the puzzle that's missing.
That's true, but it's not sufficient. So now I want to bring in consciousness one more time, because even if we digitalize a lot of the impact cannot be digitalized, right? It's the more complex one. And so unless we have a consciousness and an awareness where we voluntarily say it's not cool anymore to dominate nature, it's not cool anymore to pollute the planet without cleaning up, it's not cool anymore to not enable our workers to lead a decent life. Because even if we digitalize, that's not going to be enough without the realization and humanity demanding that as well. And that's the other piece. And I want to make sure that technology has to be in service of consciousness and not the other way around. I don't believe that Elon Musk and others have it. I think that our consciousness has been an evolutionary wonder that has been brewing for 15 billion years, if not longer, that thinking that you can replace that with a computer is very naive at best.
What you're really talking about is almost like the shifting of social norms and culture. You're saying consciousness, but you're saying like humanity as an entire culture has to move on from a model that no longer serves us into one that is hopefully a little bit more sustainable and holistic, that can be more inclusive of everybody else.
And the question is, can our current brain structure support that or not? Or is evolution going to create a new humanity that has a different brain structure that knows how to do that? Because that's what evolution does. And I think the answer to that is up to us. It's up to us. We can choose to do that.
That's I think the beauty of it ultimately. And as with I think all of these conversations, it always goes from this big macro vision of, oh, all the things that are wrong with the world, all the possibilities that could happen. But really, every time we boil down to, it's like, what can you do as an individual? Like, how can you be more accountable to your own values and how can you live by them? You've mentioned now that finding your own mindfulness practice, ensuring that you're living true to your values as one of those ways. Paying attention to where your money is being stored and stockpiled is another one of those ways. Do you have a couple maybe action items for everybody to take away that you would like to share with us in closing?
Sure. So start a mindfulness practice that speaks to you, and maybe do it with people whom you like and respect, and try out a couple. If they don't speak to you, just try it out, and something will speak to you because of who you are. And on the finances side, make sure that you understand whom you bank with, because there's alternatives out there. And it's very easy for us in America to bank with somebody who is transparent without taking any more risk. And with the 401k, that's harder because most 401ks do not allow you to specify impact objectives, right? And so put pressure on them, ask them. Just like when if you decide not to change banks, go there and ask them what they do with your money. That will already create a different level of awareness and consciousness. And they will change. If all of us were asking that question, they would change. But surround yourself with people who want to do the same thing. They will uplift you. There's so much negativity out there and so much cynicism. And I don't have that much patience for that. And I don't want to contribute to that. And as opposed to being an echo chamber for everything is so hard and everything is going down the drain. No, it's not. It's up to us. And so take action in your backyard with your family. We talked about a lot of big picture items, and that's important if that's who you are. But the closer to home you can actualize that with your partner, with your family, with where you work, and stand up for your values and speak up without judgment, without judging anybody else. I think those are the opportunities for all of us to participate in changing the system.
All right, man. Well, thank you so much for your time. Where can people go to go deeper who maybe were like intrigued enough and now they want to learn more? Where can they go to read a little bit more of this?
Yeah, so I'm just ready to publish my website, but people can already get to it. They cannot find it yet, charlykleissner.com. But if you just type that in, it's pretty much ready. I just need to have a couple of sign-offs for photos and stuff and update a couple of speeches. But in the meantime, that's my personal website. And I put some resources on that, a couple of talks and my philosophy and my values and my intentions.
All right. Thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. That was super enlightening. And keep up the great work.
I really appreciate the way that you guided me down the conversation, and it enabled me to talk about things that are really important, I think, not just for me, but hopefully for other people as well. Thank you.
Alrighty, guys, there you have it. I think this is our longest episode yet, but it was filled with so many gems of wisdom and so many interesting stories that I didn't want to cut it shorter. If you are interested in learning more about Charly, you can find him by looking for Charly Kleissner. That's Kleissner. And of course, check out the network that he's co-founded. If you have money to throw at the problem, that's Tonic, Toniic. I certainly feel like there's a ton more to learn in this financial space, so I'm probably going to try to bring on a couple new speakers to speak on that topic. If you've been enjoying this week's episode, you want to dig into the write-up and see a couple references, you can always go to impacteverywhere.org, where we always have a blog post available for you to peruse, send to friends, or even just archive for yourself. Next week, we have someone on the completely opposite end of the spectrum. We have Allison Teal, who is also known as the female Indiana Jones. She's been basically traveling the world with a pink surfboard to raise awareness for different issues, as well as create educational and entertaining content on how we can live in harmony with the earth. She's a fantastic storyteller with crazy, crazy stories, and I can't wait to introduce her to you guys in a completely new vibe. So remember, stay positive, stay inspired, because impact is everywhere.